She was the face the nation reached for when it wanted to believe in itself. Her smile lit marquees, her laughter softened editorials, and her name alone could fill stadiums and calm anxious ministers. From glossy magazine covers to the black and white of grainy newsreels, she existed in public as certainty and glamour. Yet beneath the sequins and the applause, there was a woman who listened. When she moved through rooms of power, conversations slipped into confidences as if drawn by gravity toward her. It is the paradox at the heart of this story that makes it hard to look away. The famous can be both a mirror and a key. He was an intelligence service most people outside certain corridors knew by a single name, and an aura more than by the ordinary bureaucracy of a government. He was the agent who spoke in small, precise rooms and offered narratives as if they were favors. The collision of her need and his craft set into motion a truth that reconfigured how an entire set of events would later be read. What follows is not a courtroom record, nor a sanitized press release. It is a reconstruction that traces emotion and motive alongside method and consequence. We begin at the moment when applause still smelled like the first rain, and an invitation looked only like opportunity. She grew up in a dense quarter at the edge of the city, where the air tasted of boiled sugar and exhaust. The apartment where she was raised faced a narrow lane of citrus trees and satellite dishes. Her mother sold fragrant pastries from a stall and hummed old songs while stirring syrup. Her father worked shifts at the municipal archives and came home with ink on his sleeves and small folded maps of the city he loved. As a child, she learned to perform for coins, to make a room go quiet with a line read in perfect cadence. Theater in their neighborhood was not grand but intimate, and the applause was immediate enough to teach her that attention could translate into survival. At 13, she boarded a ferry to the capital with a trunk of dresses and a single reference letter written in shaky ink by a schoolteacher who believed she had something unusual. The first months were a struggle of cheap rooms and older women who taught her how to press a dress and how to eat on a budget between rehearsals. She auditioned until her throat grew raw, and when a casting director finally said her name, she felt the vertigo of inversion from scarcity to possibility. Her sister Miriam wept at the train station the day she left and carved her initials into the wood of the platform bench. Those early struggles told her two lessons that would never leave her. The first was that visibility could be currency. The second was that behind every warm smile, someone might be counting the cost. By 23, she had already learned to negotiate a contract, to insist on a clause that protected a certain private hour each week, and to recognize the way certain men in power measured not just talent but utility. Her backstory carried within it a brittle pride and a hunger that would later be called by different names by friends and by investigators. The role that made her a national emblem came suddenly and in a manner that felt inevitable only in hindsight. It was a film about a woman caught between duty and longing, a role that matched the public mood and allowed her to embody national contradictions. On set, the lights were hot like an oven, and the smell of hair products and grease paint rose in layers. The director, an exacting man named General Fahmy, who had once served time as a cultural attaché, pushed her toward restraint in a way that revealed rather than exposed. The first night after the premiere, the city seemed to tilt because of the chorus of reviews, the paperboys at the kiosks shouting her name, and the small shopkeepers who began to play the soundtrack in their radios. Offers arrived from foundations and from personalities who wanted her at dinners that were never simply dinners. Photographers learned her walk. Editors learned her explanations. Her manager Kareem Haddad negotiated appearances that brought her into rooms where policies were discussed informally over dessert. The transition from actor to star changed her rhythms. She began to travel with escorts, with aides like Layla Mansour, who handled her wardrobe and appointments, and with a small inner circle that included Miriam, her sister, and a youth charity director named Sami, who introduced her to a set of generals and ministers. Those rooms smelled of oud and cheap cologne, and the clink of crystal. They sounded like laughter muffled to fit protocol, and like the murmur of agreements that were never written. The glamour was intoxicating, but it also brought obligations. Invitations from the presidential palace arrived with a deference that taught her how pliable public favor could be. As she moved through elite circles, the access granted to her became an axis of influence. Receptions were held in state houses where the carpets muffled footsteps and the menus were designed more for impression than for appetite. She sat beside ministers such as Azmi, whose voice could still command budgets, and by military figures such as Colonel Sami, who spoke of training exercises the way others spoke of theater rehearsals. At a particularly long reception, late in a humid summer, the lights were lowered and a pianist played an old song. The air tasted of strong coffee and rosewater. A senior official known as General Karim had a habit of removing his cufflinks as if to reveal private fatigue beneath public gold. In those settings, she learned how to pose a question that would elicit an explanation carried with the casualness of social banter but rich in technical detail. Once, during a winter gala, a logistics officer named Naguib joked about troop rotations, and a minister laughed as if the term meant nothing. She filed the language away like a brittle leaf. The sensory texture of those nights mattered, the soft velvet of curtains, the metallic tang of champagne, the velvet hush of conversations that turned serious when the cameras left. It was in a small private salon after such an event that she met a man who would come to occupy both the space of mentor and of manipulator. Their courtship unfolded in private rooms that smelled of tobacco and new books. His name in the public record was David, but among the people who knew him less formally, he was Raphael. The first evening they spoke about cinema and history and how stories shape nations. He asked precise questions about casting choices and about which roles she felt were honest and which were palatable. Their first dialogue was simple and unthreatening. She asked why he cared so much about films, and he replied that narratives could be more strategic than any brigade. She laughed, and he said that laughter was the most useful weapon in a room. She asked what he wanted in return, and he said that he wanted to understand why she moved people. She asked whether that was flattery, and he answered that it was truth. Sometimes truth is an invitation. She asked, perhaps as a test, whether he believed art could influence policy, and he replied that art was a map, if one knew how to read the lines. That exchange repeated itself in different tones over months, with 4 or 5 more layered conversations where trust was built through praise and small, apparently selfless favors. He arranged for her to meet a retired ambassador named Hussein, who spoke warmly about reconciliation. He introduced her to a philanthropist named Nadia, who funded a charity for displaced children. He sent notes with tickets to private showings and occasionally plants of jasmine for her dressing room. Sensory memories anchored each meeting: the dry rustle of a program, the sweetness of jasmine, the coarse texture of a paper envelope. Those details made intimacy feel inevitable and normal. War arrived like a sharp tremor, cutting through the rhythms she had accepted as routine. The crisis began with sudden troop movements and a sense in the capital that the normal rules were suspended. The broadcasts changed tone. News anchors spoke in terse, clipped sentences, and venues that had once hosted laughter showed empty seats. Her lover at the time, Colonel Sami, left to serve near a contested border. In a short span, the private habit of exchanging postcards became wartime letters, folded in envelopes that smelled of gun oil and laundry soap. One night, a shelling in a nearby town claimed the life of a close friend from her set, a young actor named Omar, who had been like a brother to her. The memory of that phone call is a pivot scene. She heard someone say his name, and then the line became a thin wire between a life of applause and one of urgent grief. There was blood in a hospital corridor, the antiseptic scent overpowering, and the way light fell through high windows. She stood in a room where the sound of a ventilator was a metronome, and felt that the structures that once held value now seemed brittle and arbitrary. Publicly, she made statements that lamented the violence and offered solidarity. Privately, she began to ask different questions. Why were negotiators so willing to risk lives? And what role did the hidden conversations play? The death of Omar changed her sleep architecture. Nightmares translated into a new focus. That rupture reoriented the axis of her personal thinking and created a wound that became a vector for decisions she might otherwise never have made. Grief calcified into disillusionment.
In the weeks after Omar died, she attended state funerals and watched the orchestration of condolences. She saw men who had praised the arts now dispatch directives with the exact same gestures they used to sign photographs. Parties felt like memorials for a version of the country she had loved. She began to drink to settle the nights when images returned. She received an envelope from Raphael at a low point. It contained a single line, an offer that read like a promise of agency rather than reward. Inside was a card inviting her to a small meeting in a neutral city with a person who claimed to be able to produce information that might prevent future tragedies. Her reaction was a mix of anger and appetite. She wanted revenge, but also answers. In private conversations with her sister Miriam, she said, "I do not want to be used," and Miriam answered that sometimes being used feels like participation. Friends like Layla urged caution, and Karim begged her to think of the public cost. Questions crowded in. Was this collaboration, or was it complicity? Could intelligence ever act without moral stains? The tension scene here is compact and charged. Her internal debate jostled memories of fatherly advice and of Omar in a dressing room laughing. For 3 nights, she lay awake, tasting jasmine and metal, and pictured a list of names who might have known and turned away. That mixture of rage and the promise of meaning made her susceptible to a carefully constructed approach. The recruitment was not a dramatic abduction or a cinematic ultimatum. It arrived as a sequence of gestures that looked like courtesy and empathy, and was executed by operatives who spoke in tones calibrated to her vulnerabilities. The first contact happened in a hotel room where the air tasted faintly of lemon from a hand towel. David Raphael sat with a small notebook and asked about her memories of the border town. He did not accuse, he listened, and then he offered a map. He said that there were threads that, if pulled, could spare lives. Dialogues in that room expanded into 4 to 6 exchanges that moved from explanation to bargaining. She said, "I will not trade my conscience." He said, "This is not trade, this is translation." She said, "How can I trust you?" He replied, "You may not trust us, but you can choose the nature of your action." She said, "What do you expect?" She replied, "Access to rooms you already walk into and reports of what is said." He said, "Sometimes information changes outcomes, and sometimes it only changes narratives." She asked, "What do you promise?" He said, "Protection and a measure of secrecy." The rhythm of those lines created intimacy, underwritten by power. The methods proposed were clinical meetings in neutral cities, dinners where remarks were made that could be reported, encrypted notes hidden in sheet music, and the transfer of small items such as pins with microfiles sewn into linings. Operations required patience more than daring, and the first mission was an act of listening at a diplomatic reception where a misstep could be explained as celebrity exhaustion. In those moments, she used the skills she had honed on stage to guide conversations and to extract a sentence here, a name there. Sensory detail persisted. The bend of a wrist, she noted, the roughness of a tie, the dry rustle of a program. Secondary characters such as Prime Minister Azmi, the retired Ambassador Hussein, the journalist Nadia, who later asked friendly questions, and Karim, the manager who smoothed conflicts, all played roles in reality and in the simulated cover stories that made operations plausible. The immediate consequences were small disclosures that fed into larger assessments. A report assembled in a foreign office referenced a casual admission at a private party, and that admission reoriented a planned diplomatic exchange. News did not break at once, but ripples moved through bureaucracies and into corridors where policy is made. For her, the cost began as insomnia and the sensation of living a double life. She found herself unable to tell Miriam certain truths, turning conversations away when friends asked about who she had been with. The burden of secrecy changed the texture of her relationships. She began to drink more often and to attend rehearsals with a face practiced for tiredness. The third major moment of tension in this arc is a betrayal by a close aide who was later arrested, and an interrogation scene where voices are sharp and merciless and where she experiences fear for her own safety. That interrogation contained vivid sensory impressions. The fluorescent lights hummed, the chair was cold, the tape of a microphone crackled, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. The internal monologue in those hours returned to childhood memories of the platform bench where Miriam carved initials and to Omar's last laugh. Her decisions were framed by the simple question, what is the price of protecting people you cannot name? At 1/3 of this story, we pause to acknowledge how this might
feel to you, the viewer. If this narrative has unsettled you, you are not alone. Would you defend your country or protect the people you love? Is the choice between loyalty and conscience always binary? Type defend or renounce in the comments and tell us in a sentence what you would do. Your answer matters to the conversation that follows and helps us understand how ordinary choices become extraordinary. Now back to the corridors where the operation escalated. Operations grew bolder as trust between her and the handlers deepened and as the information proved valuable. A second mission required travel to a northern capital, where she participated in a fundraiser and steered a conversation toward purchasing intentions that would later become policy leverage. Dialogues during this phase included exchanges with a banker named Yusuf, who joked about market stability, and with a diplomat named Layla, who unknowingly supplied a revealing phrase. Meetings were always orchestrated to be mundane, and thus unremarkable. The soft scrape of chairs, the metallic taste of cheap wine, the flutter of a napkin under nervous fingers. Agents such as Raphael and David managed communications through coded letters, disguised as fan mail, and through a courier named Omar, who transported a folded program with a microfiche. There were moments when moral lines blurred, and the protagonist asked whether her actions were saving lives or merely shifting advantages. A tense scene occurred when a planned disclosure prevented a violent crackdown on a village, but later led to reprisals elsewhere. In that moment, she confronted her handler and said, "I thought you said this would be different." And he said, "Outcomes are rarely pure, and sometimes the least tragic option is all we can aim for." The exchanges were short and sharp and carried the weight of statecraft. Sensory memory framed each step. The hotel carpets were threadbare, the scent of coffee was stale, and the night air tasted of rain and exhaust. As operations continued, the public world and the clandestine world began to collide. Rumors surfaced in gossip columns that did not name her but hinted at late-night meetings. A journalist named Nadia, who had once written a flattering profile, began to ask pointed questions, and a leaked photograph suggested closeness to military figures. Her manager Karim begged her to step back, and her sister Miriam said that secrecy is a poison that spreads. Social and professional circles fractured. The cost became psychological. She developed a tremor in her hand and sometimes forgot lines on stage. Friends like Layla either retreated or tried to cover for her. The final major moment of tension came when an associate was arrested and, under pressure, disclosed names. A raid occurred in a quiet district, and the smell of cordite and burnt fabric lingered. She found herself in a room where officials spoke about arrest warrants and diplomatic containment plans, and she realized that the life she had been paid to perform was drawing a circle that might include her. That decision point asked an old question. Would she flee? Would she confess? Or would she continue to serve an obscure definition of the greater good? In the months that followed, the immediate fallout looked like a slow attrition. At 1 month after the most public leak, she retreated from the stage and issued a brief statement of contrition and grief. The press filled that week with analyses, some sympathetic and some scathing. Her sister Miriam stood beside her and read prepared words that softened the tone. Publicly, the story was framed as a misjudgment of proximity, and privately she negotiated legal counsel. At 3 months, the consequences hardened. Authorities convened panels, and a former minister named Azmi called for inquiries. Her supporters divided into factions. Some called her a scapegoat, others called her a traitor. She lost several endorsements, and a charity withdrew its patronage. Social invitations stopped arriving. The sensory texture of those days was muted. The lights of cameras felt harsher, the taste of coffee turned bitter, the rustle of paper became the sound of unread letters. At 6 months, the legal and social pressure had become a form of exile.
She moved into a small flat where the curtains blocked out the boulevard she once watched from. The Jasmine no longer lived on the windowsill. Her nights were long and layered with the memories of agency briefings and of Omar's last laugh. She developed routines to survive. Mornings, simple practices like reheating tea, reading a single page of a novel, and answering only essential calls. She took up a private practice of teaching young actors, and in those rooms, absent cameras, she began to speak about the cost of choices. The epilogue in these 3 times reveals how a public fall produces different private economies. 1 month of stunned retreat, 3 months of legal and social fracture, and 6 months of exile and small acts of rebuilding. Names that appear in this story are not window dressing, they are vectors of influence. General Fahmy, who first noticed her on set, Kareem Haddad, her manager, Layla Mansour, the aide, Colonel Sami, the soldier, Miriam, the sister, David Raphael, the handler, Nadia, the journalist, Yusuf, the banker, all moved the plot through choices that were both human and institutional. Institutions such as the intelligence service and the ministries acted as actors in their own right. Their archives and memos shaped what could happen and what could be forgiven. The themes are recurring and uncomfortable: the inversion of public image, the seductive access to power, trauma as catalyst, recruitment as psychological negotiation, and the long-term costs that often look like isolation and dependence. Was it treason, or was it a tragic calculus of a woman trying to turn private pain into public protection? The moral lines resist neat answers. Her career had been built on transforming pain into narrative, and on taking roles that asked audiences to reconcile contradiction. In the end, she paid a price that
Was at once personal and emblematic of a larger system that trades secrecy for security. Her story invites us to ask whether those who perform comfort can be trusted with confidence, and whether empathy can ever justify betrayal. If this account has shifted your sense of what loyalty means, subscribe to follow more narratives that examine the collisions between fame and power. At the end, what remains are choices and the echo they leave in the lives of those who make them.